You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 36, The Road to Wickenburg.
Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas, sitting in for Norman Lau. Each week on Gene-ology, we take a leisurely ride through the early TV writing of Gene Roddenberry, long before he became the creator of Star Trek.
Along the way, we examine his pre-Star Trek work for signs of the morals, meanings, and messages more commonly associated with his more futuristic creations.
This week, buckle up for a bumpy ride down the road to Wickenburg, another episode of the classic Western series Have Gun, Will Travel. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook at MissionLogPod. While you're at it, leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on a future installment of Gene-ology. And now, pull up a seat around the fire for this week's trivia.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you very much. The Road to Wickenburg was Gene's second contribution to Season 2 of Have Gun, Will Travel. Where The Hanging of Roy Crowder aired at the beginning of October 1958, The Road to Wickenburg came at the end of that month, airing on October 25th. In between the two was Gene's final script for another Western, Jefferson Drum, on the 10th, and just days later in November, Gene's only script for the Western series, Bat Masterson, would premiere. Gene was closing out 1958 on a very busy note, and that's just the way most TV writers like it, then or now. This episode guest stars Christine White as Susan Evans. This was her second and final guest shot on Have Gun, both times playing a different character. She had also made guest appearances on Father Knows Best, West Point, The Frank Sinatra Show, and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, with many more guest starring roles yet to come in the likes of Perry Mason, The Rifleman, One Step Beyond, Bonanza, and The Twilight Zone. Her acting career is perhaps unjustly overshadowed by her lengthy relationship with James Dean. We lost Christine in 2013. Playing Sheriff Goodfellow is Harry Carey Jr., son of an actor who had his own legendary career in film westerns. Though he initially pursued a career in music, the family name opened more acting doors for Carey Jr., particularly with director John Ford. Carey's career also encompassed a lot of big-screen westerns, Rio Grande, Warpath, The Searchers, all the way up to Take a Hard Ride, The Long Riders, and Tombstone. Other film appearances included Back to the Future Part 3, Gremlins, and Cherry 2000, among too many other credits to name. During the 50s and 60s, Harry was a regular fixture on the small screen as well, having starred as a regular in The Adventures of Spin and Marty, and he put in a dozen guest shots on Have Gun alone, never as the same character, but always as some kind of authority figure. A sheriff here, a banker there, it adds up. We lost Harry Carey Jr. in 2012. If Peter Keystone looks familiar to you, you might just be a Star Trek fan. That's actor Michael Forrest. He played Apollo in Who Mourns for Adonis, and it was just one role in a storied international career. Now, the impressive stunt where Paladin leaps aboard a horse-drawn wagon, tearing through town at full speed, was almost certainly performed by Richard Boone's regular stunt double, legendary Hollywood stuntman Hal Needham, here pretty close to the beginning of his career. Needham had appeared as an extra in the first season, but wanted to instead focus on stunt work exclusively. After impressing Richard Boone with his work in a first-season episode, Needham found that he had impressed the one man with the clout to put his foot down and declare that Needham's days as an extra were over. He was now a full-time stuntman, and an amazing career was born. According to Hal's IMDb bio, he appeared in 4,500 episodes of various television shows and over 300 movies as a stuntman and stunt coordinator, and eventually turned his action-oriented style to creating films that centered around action. He co-wrote and directed Smokey and the Bandit, Cannonball Run 2, and quite a few other rollicking adventures, including Megaforce, which surely was a movie whose script focused on deeds, not words. At his peak, Hal Needham was the highest-paid stuntman in the world, and he was a certifiable legend in that field, getting his start here. Act 1. Our story begins with Paladin out cold in the floor with his gun missing? He comes to, finding his saloon girl, Susan, checking on him, and he quickly gains the upper hand on her, just in case she's up to no good. Susan fills him in on what happened. He rode into the town of Bluebell, had some drinks, flashed some large bills, and attracted the wrong kind of attention. Specifically the attention of Saul Goodfellow, who drugged Paladin's drink, took his cash, his gun, and his horse, though he left before he could find Paladin's derringer, which Susan found and now returns to him. She also found Paladin's calling card and correctly guesses that he's a gun for hire. She eagerly wants to know if Paladin plans to kill Saul for his trouble. She's had plenty of run-ins with Saul herself, and she wouldn't mind seeing him get a taste of his own medicine. She also wants Paladin to take her with him when he leaves town. He tells her to pack up and sets out to find Goodfellow. But before he can, Paladin encounters the local sheriff, who advises him to start making his way to the next town, 32 miles that-a-way. Paladin says he arrived with a horse, with a gun, and with $1,000, and he plans to leave town the same way. He also asks the sheriff where he can find Saul Goodfellow. The sheriff is distinctly uncooperative, since Paladin just called his brother a thief. Meet Sheriff Jack Goodfellow. The rest of the Goodfellow boys join him in the street, and the sheriff all but lays out exactly who played what role in robbing Paladin. Then he calls Saul out into the open, telling him that Paladin has made an accusation against him. But the only remorse Saul feels is when he smugly regrets not taking Paladin's holster when he had the chance. He fires a shot right between Paladin's feet, but Paladin doesn't budge. 2 more shots are fired at Paladin's feet. It's clear that Sheriff Goodfellow is as much a crook as the rest of his family. Saul demands Paladin hand over his gun belt. Paladin responds by walking away, looking as though he's going to unbuckle his belt, but he's instead grabbing his derringer. He whirls around and drops Saul with a single shot to the gut. Holding off the remaining Goodfellow boys with the derringer, Paladin takes his gun back, along with a roll of cash he finds on Saul's body. Only $200. Looks like all the Goodfellows took their share, and furthermore, it's looking like these guys are not good fellows in any sense of the word. Paladin is still facing 4-1 odds, and he's fired one of the derringer's 2 shots, while Saul wasted most of the ammo in his revolver. But he also spots Susan making her way to a wagon with her bags, and rattles off a little bit of history about the Battle of Bull Run. The Goodfellows think he's rambling, but he's giving Susan instructions, which she fully understands. She drives the wagon right through the Goodfellows, forcing them to scatter, and allowing Paladin to climb on as she races out of town. The 4 remaining Goodfellows, including the sheriff, mount their horses and give chase. Act 2. With a good head start on the Goodfellow gang, Paladin and Susan have time to put some diversionary tactics into play, like false wagon wheel tracks to throw them off the trail. Paladin and Susan have time to slow down, catch their breath, let their horses rest and drink, and Susan intends to take a bath and, as she puts it, wash Bluebell out of her skin. She asks Paladin for his derringer to keep him from so much as glancing in her direction while she's bathing, but he points out that he's going to be otherwise occupied anyway, trying to find something for them to eat. He returns with a freshly killed rabbit and whistles a signal to alert Susan that he has returned so she can cover up. He annoys her by leaving her to skin and clean dinner while he washes up. After dinner, Paladin tries to start mending his torn shirt, and Susan laughs and tells him that maybe a needle and thread just isn't his thing. In the morning, they'll be trying to reach Wickenburg. Paladin tells Susan that home base for him is San Francisco, and she's dropping more than a few hints that she's willing to call that home too, and that maybe they have a future together. Paladin's a bit more focused on staying alive long enough to get to Wickenburg, and even before that, he needs a good night's sleep. Act 3. Paladin and Susan continue their drive through the desert cautiously. Paladin occasionally dismounts and walks out ahead by himself to make sure it's safe to continue. Since Susan is more than capable of driving the wagon herself, they make a good team, but the road ahead includes numerous places where it would be far too easy to be pinned down in an ambush. They find another traveler whose own wagon has been forced off the road by 4 men on horseback who are asking a lot of questions. Paladin asks the young man, one Peter Keystone, if he has a gun and ammunition on him. Just as Paladin finds Peter's shotgun and ammo, shots ring out. The Goodfellow gang has laid a trap. As Paladin and the Goodfellows exchange fire, Susan and Peter hunker down and introduce themselves, as you do when there's a lot of shooting happening around you. And it quickly becomes apparent that Peter has some money. Peter's curious what Paladin means to Susan, and she dismissively says he's just a gunfighter. So they start making their own plans. Susan and Peter make a mad dash away in the wagon, leaving Paladin to his fate and surprising the Goodfellows. With his attackers distracted, Paladin is able to start taking out the Goodfellows one by one, but is caught off guard when the sheriff kills one of his own and then waves the white flag of surrender. The sheriff gives Paladin back his money and throws his shotgun to one side, urging Paladin to do the same, but perhaps unsurprisingly tries to draw his pistol, only to find that Paladin saw this coming and still had the one bullet left in his Derringer. Wickenburg, Arizona. Peter and Susan have stocked up on provisions for their journey, and just then Paladin rides into town. Oh, hey! Awkward? Peter apologizes for cutting and running, but says he was just trying to get Susan out of harm's way. Paladin waves off this apology. A gentleman always thinks of the lady first. If anything, Peter's done him a big favor by becoming the new focus of Susan's attention. Paladin rides out of Wickenburg the way he rode into Bluebell, on his own horse, with his gun on his hip, and his money in his pocket, alone. The end.
Thanks very much for that excellent recap, Earl. Always good.
Thank you very much. I still stick to my guns on my description of the Goodfellows as not good fellows.
I would agree with that assessment. In fact, I might even be willing to call them bad fellows.
Yeah, I mean, obviously no relation to Dr. Goodfellow from Season 2 of Buck Rogers, but that's a whole different show and a whole different genre.
In a whole different timeline.
Exactly. Now, those who have watched enough Have Gun Will Travel know that in the 3rd season, we have a new opening title sequence introduced. And while the show still stays with the device of the out-of-context badass line from this week's episode for a while, by the end of Season 3, the use of dialogue in the open becomes optional and varies from episode to episode. The out-of-context line over the titles this week, it just seems like Paladin's handing out random chess tips and reminding us what the knight can do. Hey, thanks, Paladin. I always have trouble remembering what each piece can do.
Yeah, and I'm but a chess novice. I was like, oh, it can move 8 different races. Well, I suppose it can. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, I guess now we know why that chess piece is on his holster. Although I think we found out back in Ella West, there are deeper reasons for the knight on his holster. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that's going to come back into play this week.
Yeah.
I did get a good laugh at Paladin's expense when Susan dumped a bucket of cold water on him in the opening scene. Okay, so just to fill you in and to remind everyone listening, about a year ago in Showtime, but just a few weeks ago on this podcast, we were laughing when Paladin was dumping water on Jimmy O'Reilly in the episode Helen of Abijanian, just a few Gene scripts ago. And so I don't know if Gene intended this to be a callback, but kind of like the fact that paybacks can happen even to Paladin.
Very well could. Very well could.
It could be just an inside joke. The show was not consumed the way we're consuming it.
Right.
We're just jumping from Gene script to Gene script without regard and, honestly, without enough time to watch everything in between. It definitely seems like there was perhaps even an unintentional callback there.
Oh, I was just saying, sometimes when you have a good idea, it's, you just roll with it.
It's never not funny to dump a bucket of water on someone.
Nah.
I really like the shot early in the episode when Paladin is leaving Susan's place and walking down that muddy path toward the main street of Bluebell. There's a lot of shade, a lot of mud, and it's a style of cinematography that does not make him look particularly tough. Once again, we have Andy McLaughlin behind the camera, and he is choosing to frame Paladin here as someone who just got rumbled for his lunch money. He does not look like the big damn hero on his way to settle the score in that scene. I thought that was a very interesting, very deliberate choice.
Yeah. It's not often that Paladin gets his butt handed to him. And, and he did like the stupid thing of, oh, look at all this money I have. I'm going to make it rain or not. And so, yeah, you flash around some cash. You're going to offend the wrong people and get your drink drugged and smacked around, robbed. Paladin didn't do himself any favors in the beginning of this episode.
Well, yeah, and Susan quite rightly points that out to him as he is, still kind of groggy and trying to figure out what in the world just happened to him.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that he wakes up and what does he do? Oh, he just grabs the woman who's like standing over him trying to wipe his face. Like she's the one trying to hurt him. No.
I wondered about that. Was he trying to gain the advantage over the first person within reach?
Right.
Or that read all kinds of weird. I mean, Paladin is not having a good day in this episode, not at all.
No. It honestly, it felt a little bit fanfic tropey. Just a little bit like, oh, I'm just going to grab you because you're the first person that I'm seeing as I'm waking up, and you might be attempting to do me more harm. But also, like, oh, I'm going to pin you in this provocative way that some people are going to be like, oh, that's hot. So what are we trying to do here?
Yeah, I didn't read it as hot. I just read it as super, super awkward. Again, it's choice. It's a choice.
It could have been done differently, and the same point still could have gotten across without him, having to top her.
True, but we're in that era of TV where you literally have one woman in the show, and you kind of know she's going to be the romantic interest for somebody.
Right.
The format of television at the time telegraphs that from a long way off. It kind of reminds me of the story Gene used to tell at conventions, and this is famously immortalized on the LP inside Star Trek, where Gene apparently, or supposedly, as the legend goes, as he tells it, he had a discussion with the network heads about having an equal number of men and women on the Enterprise. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, gosh, no. What sort of hanky-panky will we be implying? And so all of a sudden, it's 2/3 men, 1/3 women. But now what are we implying? The ratio was just completely arbitrary, and no matter how you flipped it, it didn't affect the actual story. So I wonder if the same thing is in play here, where we are still running into a lot of episodes. Last week's was a good example. Not a single woman anywhere in the story.
Right.
And so when a woman shows up in TV of this era, somebody is going to be moon-eyed over her. That's her function in the show.
Right.
Hopefully we start to outgrow that during the run of Have Gun Will Travel, because we're going to be covering this show for a while yet. Once the character started mentioning Wickenburg as a sort of way station en route back to San Francisco, I was a little curious as to whether or not that's a real place, and it turns out, yes, it is. Wickenburg, Arizona was founded in 1863 by a German gold prospector named Henry Wickenburg, and he struck it rich when gold was found and mined nearby on his claim. Jack Swilling, one of the future founders of Phoenix, Arizona, also lived there for a while, and Wickenburg was on the map 4 years before Phoenix was. And it would have been on the map for only about a decade at the time this episode takes place. So, a little bit of interesting history there. Wickenburg is a real place. Now, it would appear that nearby Bluebell, on the other hand, was invented out of whole cloth, which is probably a good idea if you're writing a TV script that insinuates that the local law enforcement is effectively a criminal operation. Don't offend an entire real town with that part of the story.
Reasonable.
This episode is an outlier from the usual. Paladin does not collect a fee here, nor is he setting out to right a wrong done to someone else. Now, I kind of wondered, I don't know if you picked up on this, if he is riding through Bluebell and he's got $1,000 in his pocket, is he coming back from a job that he just completed?
That would have been my thought. It was like, oh, Paladin must have worked another good-sized job in another town and is passing through. Maybe showing off? I don't know.
Could be. Now, it's only $1,000, not the $5,000 he wanted from Sid Carter.
Right.
And not the 10% of Tomahawk Carter's season. So, maybe he just mowed somebody's lawn?
Maybe so.
Yeah, for that he only charges...
Lots of lawn to mow in the desert.
Yeah, for that he only charges $1,000.
That's right.
The wrong that Paladin is trying to set right was done to him, and ultimately he's just trying to restore his own status quo. Last week I was questioning what Plan B was in the hanging of Roy Carter, and I find myself wondering that here too. Because thanks to the local topography and Peter Keystone providing a bit of a distraction, Paladin has to fight it out with the Goodfellows far away from any city limits or any help. And maybe he was anticipating that as he was scouting ahead. But let's say that he and Susan reach Wickenburg with the Goodfellows, an hour or 3 behind them. Then what? Do they stay in Wickenburg? Because once Goodfellow rides into town flashing his sheriff's badge at the local sheriff, he can tell them, oh hey, that Paladin, he's a dangerous criminal. And then Paladin is in an even worse position because now there are more people chasing him.
Yeah. I had myself thinking a similar thought when he's like, oh, I'm going to mosey out into the alley or into the street and face off against the sheriff, talk to the sheriff like, oh, you got to arrest this guy, blah, blah, blah. Well, of course, we find out, oh, that's my brother you're talking about. Obviously, he didn't do such a thing. And even if he did, it's not his fault or whatever. Obviously, Paladin's not going to get anywhere with these guys. I don't know what he anticipated. Like, was he just lucky Susan walked out when she did? Or was he banking on chewing the scenery until she did? What if she'd been like, oh no, there's a gunfight, I'm going to stay out of the way, versus whatever this, showdown is going to become. And he's lucky that she was sharp enough to say, oh, hey, I need you to do this like at Bull Run. Like, I'm like, my goodness, you're lucky that she's sharp and thinks on her feet, because if it had been anybody else that didn't, been out of luck.
Yeah, and what would he have done if the Goodfellows just decided, hey, we're just going to start shooting and we're not going to shoot at your feet. We're just going to take you out.
Mm-hmm.
A backup plan, Paladin, come on. I mean, just maybe be workshopping one in the back of your head. It would be a good idea to keep an eye on the exits or something, if you're conscious.
His plan only works if it works, There's no backup. There's no secondary line of defense. It's, well, crap, I've got to, dive behind this cactus or whatever,
Speaking of the Goodfellows, I hear there's a vacancy in Bluebell. Actually, a whole bunch of vacancies. So I know they have to keep the number of extras down for the sake of budget, but it seems to me like Paladin just depopulated 1/5 of that town.
And was it just me? Again, silly observation. Did Did Uncle Roy look like he could have been like same age or younger than the other guys? Like Uncle Roy, you usually think of your uncle as like an older figure in your life, but Uncle Roy must have been somebody's kid brother.
I am trying to remember when the American television standard changed from the low number of horizontal lines that it started out with versus the higher number, which we now regard as 480p, but I believe technically, if you include the parts of the screen that, extend beyond the top and bottom of the tube, it's actually 525 lines, which is NTSC video. There was a change in there at some point where the resolution increased, and I don't know if it happened before or after Have Gun Will Travel. Now, film, this would be an amazing show to see rescanned in HD, because it was shot on film, and so you could rescan every episode, clean the film, rescan every episode, and have the show in high definition. And I think for the most part it would look amazing. But as has been pointed out many times on Regular Mission Log, there are places where rescanning the original Star Trek and Next Generation at HD in a few places did things no favor, because while shot on film, on 35mm film, the shows were always meant to be seen in standard def television form, and HD can be sometimes a little unforgiving. So I feel like maybe Uncle Roy's age relative to everyone else was something that we were supposed to just take from the implication in the dialogue and not really be able to see.
He just looked like pretty ripped for being somebody's uncle. Plus, he had a big beard. So, like, Uncle Roy looks like he's been hitting the rack.
Okay, Ashley, I'm sure the road to Wickenburg was paved with good intentions. It still feels like this story might have hit some potholes along the way. What do you think?
A few. I've got some questions that, again, may not have been intended to be answered in a 26-minute TV show, but Susan's pretty interesting figure here in this episode. So, what did you think about Susan, Earl?
Well, here's the funny thing. We talked about Ella West 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having to try real hard to make sure our podcast about the road to Wickenburg does not become a second podcast about Ella West. It's interesting that Paladin does not think twice about telling Susan to pack her things and be ready to ride out in a hurry. That is not an offer he made to Ella.
Right.
One could argue, I guess, if you were feeling particularly uncharitable, that Ella put herself in a bad situation of her own making, especially with the heavy drinking.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we don't necessarily know that about Susan. We really don't have any backstory on her at all, other than the baggage that goes with being a saloon girl.
Well, and we get a little piece of her story, but we get this after the fact that Paladin has already said, yeah, come on, let's get out of here. She's a saloon girl. Obviously, the good fellas, or whatever their names were, didn't do her any favors either. They're messing up her bar. Paladin makes a comment about her when she originally came to Bluebell being a teacher. She said something. He's like, so you used to be a teacher, and now she's a saloon girl. I was like, ooh, well, that's interesting. What changed there? Was Bluebell such a place where either there were no children to educate, or two, there were families uninterested in education, therefore their kids didn't go to school, therefore we see the kind of lawlessness that's running around in Bluebell, which, all tied to lack of education and corruption and things like that, of which lack of education is a part. So did she just see no other place for her here other than to be a saloon girl? I don't know. When we're first introduced to her, I have some pity for her, because it sounds like she's a victim of circumstance. She says the line, something like, pride along with learning can be beat out of you. I was like, well, dang, what happened to her to make her believe that? Because that's certainly, at least in the beginning of the episode, how it seems. And then she says to Paladin, I've seen, she says, I've seen enough in the world to kind of, for want of better terminology, know how things are. She says, I'm pretty, ain't I? When I'm all dressed up, no man would be ashamed of me. You can come and go as you please, but, I just want you to be nice to me when you're in town. I'm like, oh.
That line registered with me as well. I've found it distressing that she sets the bar for a healthy relationship as, and I wrote this quote down exactly, just be nice to me once in a while.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So are we meant to read that as when Paladin's in town, she'd like it if he took her on a date? Or are we meant to read this as Susan is a, again, for want of better terminology, sexually liberated woman? She even says later in the episode, men are all the same. Or no, she says at the beginning, and she says at the end too, you men are all the same. So obviously she's experienced some sort of abuse and or discrimination in her life to make her think that. And therefore she seems to want to go wherever her bread is buttered. Basically, she's hedging her bets, not just with Paladin, but what was the name of the young man that they ran across? Peter. Yeah. So as soon as she encounters Paladin seems like a good ticket out of Bluebell. Let's get out of Dodge together. Okay. Well, let's get out of Bluebell together. Then you've got Peter, or she finds out he asks a whole bunch of questions, but then he's pretty forthcoming, like, oh, my dad owns blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, here's a rich, nice young man who can afford me a bit of finety, versus with Paladin, it's going to be rough riding, at least getting out of Bluebell into Wickenburg, into a better town where it's not run by these quote-unquote good fellas who are not good fellas.
I keep finding very interesting, because the whole thing is sort of an ethical minefield, that burgeoning relationship between Peter and Susan, because it feels like I can't figure out who is taking advantage of the situation more.
Good catch.
Obviously, nobody wants to hunker down behind a wagon while there are shots ringing out around you. Totally get that. That's one of those no atheists in foxholes kind of situations.
Right.
But obviously they are, to use the appropriate slang, taking a shine to each other. Mm-hmm. I can't figure out if she is taking more advantage of Peter, or if he's more like, hey, here's a pretty girl pinned down by a bunch of thugs with guns. I bet I can convince her to get out of here with me. This takes me back to Ella West, and what I said to Ella West: your escape from a bad situation is not a person, it's a better situation. And so I'm really a bit skittish, especially since in that last scene, that sort of slightly comedic button-off scene at the end, you really get the sense Peter is not driving the wagon on this relationship.
Right.
Is this built to last, or is she hanging on until the next better thing comes along?
Well, and, he even says earlier in the episode that he's out traveling to gain experience. So this is perhaps a young man who's a little more naive than he should be at his age. And yes, he's trying to do the gentlemanly thing of getting Susan out of danger, which, is commendable. Also, the fact that they're having this entire, seemingly calm sidebar conversation while shots are flying all around them, Y'all are way more calm than I would be. I'd have been, like, ducking behind the rocks and not moving and not saying a word because I don't want them to hear where to shoot, you know? I interpreted it as Peter is not quite as world-weary as Susan, not quite as knowledgeable about how the world works as he should be. And therefore, Susan, the way, she even says, he's like, well, does this man not mean anything to you? She's like, nah, we're practically strangers. It's like, girlfriend, you just sort of like throwing yourself at him the night before.
It felt like Gene was kind of trying to reuse some of Ella West here.
Yeah.
And it just didn't quite work. Now, I felt like our actress playing Susan here was doing a better job and showing more shades and subtleties than Norma Crane did as Ella West. Because I think we both commented Ella West seemed like kind of like someone who's doing live-action Yosemite Sam.
Right.
Live-action gender-flipped Yosemite Sam.
Right.
And it was hard to take her seriously. Susan she seems like she's a bit more mature as a character and is written a bit more maturely, but still there are some issues here. And I feel like it's important to point out that while we are spotting this, watching this show the way we're watching it, just hopping from Gene Roddenberry script to Gene Roddenberry script and not stopping to look at every single episode of Have Gun Will Travel, the contrast is more pronounced to us than it would have been for the 1958 audience.
Right.
Watching the show in real time. Especially since when they are doing 39 shows a year, you have this very narrow window of reruns that happen in the summer, which is traditionally outside time, so people may not necessarily have watched them. And so it could be that in this ecosystem of doing 39, 40 shows a year, your writers and producers are probably kind of counting on some forgetfulness on the audience's part.
Right.
So they're not watching it like we're watching it. The contrast and the similarities are sticking out a lot more to us than they would have to the average viewer in 58.
Yeah.
Now, as far as what brought Susan to this point, I did a little bit of reading last night because I wanted to make sure I completely understood what role she was playing in town. There was sometimes a tendency, including in other westerns, to mix up the saloon girl with, shall we say, ladies of the night.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, two entirely different job descriptions.
Right.
The saloon girls were employees of the bar who were there to maybe flirt just a little bit with the customers and get them to buy the ladies drinks and keep dancing. Keep them in the bar. Keep them spending money. Keep them drinking. And while in the meantime, since they were employees of the bar, when a guy would buy them a drink, the bartender would serve them something that had no alcohol in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was no loss of control or agency there. You know, the ladies were still driving that particular train and staying on their toes and not being taken advantage of. Despite that, this was still not a job that anyone actively sought out. It was an alternative to working in the fields. It was an alternative to even more thankless manual labor. So I can see where she might have arrived in Bluebell as a teacher and fell on this as her last resort. Now, as it turns out, with the Goodfellows running roughshod over the entire town for their own enrichment, it still was not an easy job for her.
Right.
In that opening scene, she says she's felt Saul Goodfellow's boot as well, which I don't even... Considering that Paladin has apparently had the bleep kicked out of him, I don't even want to think about what her experience was. Yeah, not a job that she rode into town with a resume trying to find, but the job she wound up with trying to avoid worse.
With that in mind, I see her as someone who is simply trying to survive, but at the same time, she also is like taking advantage of the other people in her life in order to better her situation. Which I don't blame her for wanting to better her situation. Not at all. Not at all.
And really, if you think about that job description, that's what she's been trained to do.
Yeah.
As a saloon girl.
Yeah.
You're taking
you're
advantage
exactly
of all
right.
these guys. You're fluttering your eyelashes and, hey, big boy, buy me a drink.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the job. And after a while, I could see where that would become second nature for her.
Yeah.
And, as far as trying to better her situation and survive by whatever means are necessary, it's obvious that everyone else in Bluebell is operating by that same rule, especially the guys who are in charge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I can totally see why she is clinging to the first ride out, even if it's a guy who's got the entire town chasing him and shooting at him.
Right.
It's better than staying.
At least she can drive the wagon. Drive that wagon pretty dang fast. That was cool.
She really is kind of, in some areas of ability, she's just about Paladin's equal. I did like seeing that.
Yeah. When he says, "Oh, I got this," she's like, "I'll get my part." Like, she's like, "No, I can do this too." She's like, "I can match you." Even to the point of, "Give me your Derringer, because if you try to look at me, I'm going to shoot you."
Okay, so now about that, would this story have been better served, or would it have opened up a whole different can of worms that we would be asking about right about now if she had been someone who can expertly handle a firearm?
That's a good question. I'm thinking of the classic film 9 to 5. She's basically having a similar conversation here. I've got a gun out there in my person. Up to now, I've been forgiving and forgetting because that's the way I was brought up. But I swear, if you say another word about me, I'll get that gun of mine and I'll change you from a rooster to a hen with one shot. It was on my mind because I watched that movie this weekend. But, it's kind of that same vibe. Like, and Paladin laughs because he's like, "Nah, if you try to shoot me, you're going to give our position away. So no, don't do that." And that's where, you find out that Susan's got some more education because he who's the philosopher that he quotes there? I don't remember.
I don't remember either, but she finishes the quote for him.
Right. Trust no one with your life that you cannot also trust with your virtue. So I think there's a lot of stuff that I find really fascinating and I like about Susan. I think she's definitely a different sort of woman character than what we would normally get in shows like these. But at the same time, she also doesn't come out looking great by the end of the episode either. Mr. Keystone, thank you. And then she says, "Can you believe that? Blah, blah, blah. I can't believe he'd say that." And she's like, "I saw right through him the whole time." And he's like, "I have a feeling he was looking right through you." It's like, okay, do you now understand what Susan's trying to do here, Peter? Or are you still going to go with her or let her come with you? Like, I don't know. The episode left a lot of doors open that I kind of wish we'd had a better handle on, for want better terminology. I don't know. What did you think about that, my friend?
I think we're once again seeing Gene bumping up against the limitations of having only a half hour to tell the story.
Yeah, I think that's
There's
fair.
a lot of implication here that if you leave it with the audience, well, then more than half century later, people are doing a podcast about it, and we're sitting here going, what the heck? It seems like maybe Peter grew up just a little bit between that tag scene and the scene before. Obviously,
Right.
there's been a little bit of passage of time. Paladin looks like he's had a rough ride into Wickenburg. Of course, it's implied earlier that one of the good fellows stole his horse and was riding that horse. So his horse was right there.
Right, so I guess he stole it back.
He stole it back. What happened to the rest of the horses? I guess don't worry about that. So he was able to go from where that ambush happened straight into Wickenburg, but he took his time. Looks like it was a hot, sweaty ride on horseback, not a pleasant thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some passage of time, and I don't know if Peter has begun sizing Susan up in that time on his own, or if it takes Paladin showing up and just giving her, that stare. Because that stare, that is not for Peter. That is fully for her. And that leads me into some questions I have for our wrap-up. So meet me there, because I still have so many questions, and it seems like we've been talking about this for quite a while. Yeah. I still have lots of questions about this story.
Same. All right, Earl. Let's bring this horse back into the barn. Or what are your final thoughts as we wrap up the episode?
I have so many final thoughts, and so many of them have question marks after them. I'm having a hard time with this one. As far as messages go, there doesn't always have to be one. Sometimes it's just a rollicking story. But there are some overtones to this story that are still bothering me. We are on our not third straight, but our third Gene Roddenberry script for Have Gun, Will Travel, with a woman in the prominent guest starring role. Now, the first of those, Helen of Abijanian, gave its main guest star some real agency, though in hindsight, she almost becomes a background character. Most of the fireworks are happening with her dad, and with her would-be husband, and with Paladin. Yes, she is drawing attention and doing the dance in the background, but all of the drama is happening between the guys, so that's a bit of a miscue, shall we say. Things changed a bit with Ella West. The episode is all about her, but the messages built into it were maybe just a little bit troubling. And now we are traveling down the road to Wickenburg. I have two conflicting views here. Actually, I have a pile of conflicting views here. But I'm desperately trying to keep it concise. The script is very deliberately pointing Susan out to us as an opportunist, to put it lightly. Like Ella West, she sees Paladin as her ticket out of the situation she's in. But the moment she sees another potential exit, she takes it, even though it means leaving Paladin in a situation that, judging by the fact that he is pinned down facing 4-1 odds, he probably would not survive if he were anything other than Paladin. At the same time, though, I cannot fault Susan for not having that much loyalty to Paladin, because if he was any more emotionally unavailable, after she had that moment of emotional vulnerability with him, he would require a 48-foot-tall neon sign flashing the words emotionally unavailable that could be seen from orbit. So, it's easy to see from her vantage point, there is no future with Paladin. But my gut still tells me there's got to be some option other than leaving him to face seemingly unsurvivable odds. We know Paladin's going to make it. He's in the credits. But this week it seems like the other characters know that too, and they're just like, okay, out of here, see ya. I'm also not sure what to make of her, oh, you men are all the same sassing that's going on. I'm sure at the time that may have made her seem extremely liberated, but it hits different when the story turns around and points out to the audience, in the form of that steely stare from Paladin right at the end, Susan is a shameless opportunist and we should be judging her on that basis. I'm trying to imagine what the audience thought of this in 1958, and I'm really drawing a blank because I'm not sure what I make of it now. I don't know what the message was here, and what I did pick up on, I'm not sure I'm any more comfortable with it than I was with Ella West. Is this just me? I felt like this was a branch office of Ella West. It's Ella East. What did you find here? I'm going to stop talking because I have no answers. I have only questions.
I think ultimately I pity Susan for how she got into the position that she is in. Because based on what we know about her, when she originally arrived at Bluebell, she was going to be a teacher. That didn't work out for various and sundry reasons that we aren't privy to. So now she's a saloon girl, which, as your research would indicate, is not a position that anyone chooses unless the other option is the oldest profession. So there's that to consider. It doesn't look like she has any support. She doesn't have family in town that she can lean on, or friends that aren't trying to take advantage of her or get something from her. And so she has been in a position where she has seen the rougher side of life and therefore believes, yes, all men are the same. They're just trying to take advantage of you, trying to get what they can get from you, blah, blah, blah. And so she meets someone like Paladin, who is one she sees as a way out. And, you know, he's willing to take her as far as Wickenburg. Okay. Well, she's certainly being treated better by him than any of the other men that she has previously encountered. And, you know, if the good fellows are any indicator, then probably the rest of the men in the town aren't that much better. So there's that. So she sees something different in Paladin. But at the same time, he is incredibly emotionally unavailable. So she kind of defaults back, again, for want of better terminology, like a defensive position. Like, oh, well, you know, if you're going to be unavailable, then I need to go with someone who is. And then so she meets Peter. Peter is kind-hearted, or at least seems to be. You know, we're meant to, based on that final scene, we're meant to interpret him as like kind of he's trying to be a gentleman and help her out of a, you know, dangerous situation. And, you know, he's well off, and so he fixes her up with nice clothes. You know, they come out of the store hauling like an armload of packages. So obviously this guy's well off. He's a better meal ticket than Paladin, or at least it would seem someone a little more stable. He's not going all over creation. So I don't blame her for being the way she is. But at the same time, I don't think it's good for anybody to be opportunistic.
Okay, I think you just sharpened my focus here and made me realize what's troubling me here.
Go for it.
Yes, we should feel pity for Susan. The script and perhaps the direction, I don't know if that stare down at the end is in the script or if it was purely an invention of the director and the actor. There seems to be a clear indication. Don't feel too much pity for her. Judge her. It seems like the story is telling us, okay, we should be sitting in judgment of her, despite the fact that she has engineered for herself a way out of this terrible, terrible town.
Right.
To the best of our knowledge, she has not hurt anyone in so doing. We don't know what the future holds for her and Peter. But, you know, like you pointed out, he's coming out of that general store with a lot of provisions, so clearly he is playing the Oregon Trail in expert mode. He has the money to pull that off, and so nobody's dying of dysentery here.
We even got to ford the river in this episode. That was all I could think about.
I was thinking about the Apple II version of the Oregon Trail, where all you could see is the horse heads and the top of the wagon. But it just feels like the story is telling us, okay, there's a problem here, when maybe there is no problem here. Maybe the problem, and I shudder to say this because I know we want to think the best of our writer whose work we are following. But he is the product of his time, and his worldview is evolving. And so it seems like the story is telling us, oh no, you should still be suspicious of her. Why? What awaits her if she doesn't engineer that escape route?
Right. You know, in a time when professions for women were very limited, you could not necessarily easily find a way to earn, income and make provision for yourself on your own. I mean, I think she is doing what she needs to do to survive. And I don't blame her for that at all.
Right.
But this is meant to read as her being an opportunist and not girlfriend's just trying to do what she got to do to be able to live. And there are worse ways she could do that than by ending up with a nice man like Peter.
Okay, you know what? You have actually... I'm doing a 180 here. Mind blown. Okay, thank you. Because, she's not a bad character. She's doing what she has to do. No good awaits her staying put.
None.
And, it seems like from that scene with Paladin, she is seeking some emotional stability as well as financial. Why shouldn't she? It's funny because you look at television now, and we're perfectly okay with just as many women being villains as men.
Mm-hmm.
At this point in American history, when this show was being rolled out brand new on the air, women were facing enough problems just at home. Not being able to have their own line of credit. No-fault divorce was not a thing. You couldn't get out of that bad situation. They really weren't far removed from Susan Evans in this episode. In 1958.
No. And, my mom was born in 1949, so she would have been 9 years old when this is on the air. And my mom still grew up in an era when women still didn't work outside the home that much. What year could women have their own bank accounts? 1972?
Yeah, it was in the early 70s.
Early 70s. So, my mom would have been, 20-something, 1920. And so when this is on the air, women still look to men as their meal ticket, their way of provision. If you didn't get married, you were considered a burden to your parents in some way. Nobody would say that explicitly, but they're like, oh, poor so-and-so, she never found a man, she never got married. Sadly, it was still pretty reflective of their time, and I'm not going to be mad at Susan for doing what she needs to do, even if I don't agree with her methods.
No. Okay, yeah, okay, you've brought me around completely. Okay, so, my only message for Susan at this point is, don't give a bleep. If anyone thinks you're an opportunist, you go, girl. Get the hell out of there. And, Paladin and his judgy look can just ride his hot, sweaty horse back to San Francisco with that judgy look.
In the words of Paladin himself, Paladin, go take a bath.
Exactly. Wow. Okay. I started this podcast in one place, and I have ended up in a completely different place. Thank you, Ashley.
Hey, you know what? If it helps, my thoughts kind of evolved a little bit as we were discussing. So I'm very much a verbal processor. That's why I like podcasts. So this was good for me too, friend. Mind
blown. I have nothing else to say here except the Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, Juliet.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David DeCacci.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.